Going into round 8 of the Qatar Masters Open, 3 players shared the lead: Carlsen, Mamedyarov and Sergirov. And I'd like to take a look at the top of the table clash between Shahriar Mamedyarov and Magnus Carlsen. So Mamedyarov with the white pieces, and he's played his customary d4. And Magnus goes for a ragazin with black. Can lead to sharp positions, but also, if white wants to play very solidly, well, can also lead to a draw. Bishop g5 from Mamedyarov. This is all pretty regular stuff so far. And now, well, if bishop h4, then the pawn can be taken on c4, and probably okay for black. So Mamedyarov played the standard move, taking on f6. And now if white wants to keep more tension, the most tension in the position, he can give a check on a4. That forces black into playing knight c6, and then you exchange on d5. And the argument is that perhaps with this particular pawn structure, the knight is slightly misplaced on c6, and then e3, and so on. This was the variation that Carlsen played against Aronian in Vaikonze last year, and won a very nice strategic game. But, well, this is a very tense position. But instead of this, Mamedyarov played e3. Okay, a very normal, standard move. And the argument for playing this way is that if you don't exchange on d5, then it keeps the bishop on c8 blocked in. But in this position, it means that when, well, black can trade on c4 and then hit out with c5. So let's see how this goes. You might recall that in this position last year, again in Vaikonze, Ivanchuk recaptured on d4 with a knight against Carlsen, and Carlsen equalized the position very quickly in this way. And in fact, the players repeated the position straight away here. Draw after just a few moves. So Ivanchuk just played without any ambition with the white pieces. Well, maybe that's understandable when you're playing the world champion, but today clearly Mamedyarov wanted to play for a win, and he played here knight e4. So the queen dropped back, and now e takes d4. So we have a typical isolated queen pawn position. But there, well, I say typical, but the pieces that remain on the board perhaps not so typical, in that black has the 2 bishops. Rook d8 from Carlsen, so putting immediate pressure on the d file. Good move. Black's only problem in this position is that bishop on c8. That this is the typical problem with Queen's Gambit declined type positions. If you can get this bishop to a decent square, usually on this diagonal, then black has solved his problems. But it takes a bit of time to do that. This is a familiar position, actually. It's been seen a few times before. And, well, in fact, Mamedyarov has had this with the white pieces. And his opponent played bishop d7. And Mamedyarov dropped the bishop back straight away to try to get some attack on this diagonal. And, well, he eventually won the game, but it was quite double-edged. But instead of bishop d7 immediately, Carlsen played bishop to a5, and I like this very much. There's no need to develop the bishop yet, but it's a very nice idea to bring the bishop to b6 to apply immediate pressure on the d4 pawn. And it's not so easy for white to get his attack going when he has to take care of this d-pawn. Mamedyarov played knight g3, and now bishop b6. So you can see straight away the pawn on d4 is attacked. And here, this is actually quite a big decision for white, because if he wants to kind of steer the game towards a draw, then you could play d5 here. Black exchanges, and probably best to exchange queens. And here you could say, well, black has a symbolic advantage with the two bishops, but with white so well developed and that bishop on a splendid square on d5, I think odds on this position is going to be a draw. I mean, maybe black could play something like bishop e6 to get rid of that bishop, but I really can't see any other result apart from a draw here. But Mamedyarov wanted to keep some play in the position. I think it was probably just too early for him to contemplate going, playing for a draw. He played queen e4, and this looks like a very nice move, very active move. Defends the d pawn, of course, but looking at the king side, perhaps looking to switch over here and looking down that dangerous diagonal towards the king. So now it's time for black to develop. Bishop d7. Doesn't look like a very good square, but this bishop, as we'll see, wants to drop back to e8. And now h4 from Mamedyarov. Previously, knight h5 had been played, but actually after bishop e8, this just gets nowhere. And then g6. It's quite nice that that bishop actually is able to support the g-pawn, so there's never any sacrificial nonsense against that pawn. Black was fine there. Mamedyarov played h4, which I have to say I quite like, because sometimes it could be useful to keep this diagonal open with h5, but also it gives the king an escape square on the back rank in case the position blows open. Carlsen very quickly played bishop e8. Good move. Looks very modest, but this tucks the bishop out of the way, makes sure that there's still pressure on the d-pawn from the rook, but crucially the rooks are now connected. So yes, one would prefer to have this bishop on the long diagonal, but well, there's still time for it to get there. But actually the bishop on e8 is a very useful defensive piece, covering f7, but also covering some squares here, as we're about to see. Let's, for example, if bishop d3 here, threatening something on this diagonal, then f5 is a good move, and then simply queen f6, and you can see, okay, first of all, there's increased pressure on the pawn on d4. You can see all these pieces of black's hit d4, but that bishop on e8 covers h5, so black doesn't have to think about any nonsense with knight h5. Very useful, and the bishop can sometimes just go to f7 as well. If, for example, bishop c4, then bishop f7 closes that diagonal, defends the e-pawn. Let me see, a3 was played by Mamedyarov. He could still have simplified with d5 here, but I think by this stage it's not quite as good with black having developed the bishop. I know not a very active square, but the point is the rooks are connected, so I think black could be thinking about an advantage in that endgame. Anyway, he played a3, and now, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what a3 achieves, because Magnus now played in a very routine way, just preparing to double rooks on the d-file, and that is now serious pressure. And this is perhaps the last chance to play d5, but I think that already black has a little bit of advantage in this endgame. No problems with queenside development, and long-term advantage of the two bishops. He can certainly try to win that one. Anyway, instead of this, Mamedyarov played queen g4. He's still thinking about the king side, which is quite understandable when you have an IQP and you've got active pieces. But black is now really harmoniously developed. And look at that pressure on d4. We've got 4 pieces trained on that pawn, and now it's serious. Well, Mamedyarov had planned d5. Now, of course, if this is taken, then knight f5 is extremely nasty, all these points hit. But after precisely 16 seconds, Magnus flipped out queen f8. It's a very strong move. So just withdrawing from any potential nonsense with the knight coming to f5. So now actually e takes d5 is a serious threat. And also, covering g7. So, well, for example, if white were to play knight e4 here, then f5 is very strong, hitting those two. And if instead knight h5, g7 is covered by the queen, and again f5 is incredibly strong, hitting the queen and also opening up the bishop's diagonal. Once again, that bishop on e8 proving very powerfully placed. Mamedyarov is already in deep trouble. He played queen e4, protecting the d5 pawn. But a simple move, knight e7. Remember, this pawn is pinned. White cannot take on e6 because d1 hangs. So this pawn is basically gone. Bishop d3 threatens a mate. That was dealt with very quickly. After precisely 8 seconds, Carlsen played f5, hitting the queen. Queen came to e5, and now knight takes d5. And this is just a clear pawn up for black. And actually, because black is so compact, there'll be very few problems in converting the extra pawn. That queen can come to f6, for example, to trade queens. And in the long term, that pawn on f2 threatened by the bishop is vulnerable. But of course, yeah, there's going to be trouble on the d file as well with these beautifully doubled rooks. So Mamedyarov now played a really desperate move. As Carlsen said afterwards, he collapsed completely. This was taken. Looks scary at first, but actually Magnus had prepared a very simple move, rook c6, and after this Mamedyarov resigned. Shocking. 25 moves. He loses with white. So what happens on rook c6? Well, first of all, we should note that if rook takes knight, then the rook on c1 hangs. And if rook takes c6, then the best is pawn takes, just supporting the knight, and black is a piece up for nothing. And if white withdraws the rook to b1, so threatening the knight. Well, I mean, there are various moves here, but this is perhaps the simplest way to go. And the point is that, well, it removes any nonsense with knight e7. It avoids this check, central check. And if rook takes knight, then rook c5 skewers queen and knight. So black simply remains a piece up. An absolutely crushing victory. Now, you could say, is this more of a victory for Carlsen, or is it more of a collapse by Mamedyarov? Well, it's a bit of both. But I have to say, I don't think we should take anything away from Magnus here, because actually his defensive moves were precise. Right from, well, going back to, let's say, move 14, where he played bishop a5 instead of playing bishop d7 immediately. So I think his defense was really accurate. I say defense. These were just, I think, the best moves in the position. Not half best moves, the best moves that put the most pressure on white. And, well, Mamedyarov declined to simplify the position. Maybe he just felt he'd be slightly worse. And, well, Magnus thoroughly deserved this quick victory. So, going into the last round, Carlsen is out on his own with 6.5. I should say that Kramnik defeated Sugirov. So last round pairings, Carlsen 6.5 points against Kramnik, who has 6. Yu Yangyi has 6 points, and he plays Wesley So, who has 5.5. There's a stack of players on 5.5, but only those 3 players will win the tournament. Will we see a repeat of last year where Yu Yangyi snuck in at the end? Let's see. The round begins 3 hours earlier than usual tomorrow. Don't miss it.